please distribute these handouts in an efficient manner that is in no way disruptive to the meeting. Good evening, fellow Toastmasters. Have any of you seen Syria on the news lately? Now, those of you who've seen Syria on the news, how many of you can find Syria on a map? Very good. I'm very impressed. That's awesome. I wasn't completely certain. I could kind of get close, but I was actually a little surprised when I realized who all its neighbors were, so good job. Now, almost 2,000 years ago, Saul of Tarsus was on the road to Damascus, which is in present-day Syria, when he was struck blind and was addressed by the risen Lord, Jesus Christ. Today, Damascus has about 2 million residents, and they are most at risk of persecution, not from an incredibly zealous Pharisee who's bent on crushing the Christian religion in its infancy, but rather the theoretically freely elected president of their own country. Now, when I say theoretically, what I mean is that the gentleman in question was elected to the presidency, coincidentally enough, the month after his father died. And more coincidentally than that, his father had been president up until the minute he died. And more coincidentally than that, he'd been president for the previous 29 years. And since the current president has been president, he's been reelected twice with an average electoral vote of about 98%. And they pretty much haven't even bothered scheduling the next election coming up. Now, Syria is located in the Middle East. First of all, check that out. It's very, very old. Damascus is seriously one of the oldest cities on earth. Right? It's right there. See, just in case you weren't sure. It's got the best neighbors ever. I love this. Their neighbors are Iraq and Saudi Arabia and stuff like that. They do have Turkey up here, and Turkey is pretty reasonable. They also have Lebanon, which, well, anyway. The thing you need to understand about Syria is that it is incredibly moderate by local standards. Okay? When you think about crazy dictators, you think about Saddam Hussein, Charles Taylor, people in places like Zimbabwe and Venezuela. Yeah, that's not these people. These people are actually relatively reasonable. While on the one hand, you have all of these, oppressive things. You can talk about how people weren't elected properly and how the police can just make you disappear and stuff like that. But at the same time, the president speaks English and he tries to make friends with relatively recent, normal people. He'll hang out with the president of the UN and say, yeah, we'll totally have a ceasefire. It's great. We're cool, man. We don't kill our people. He tries to be nice. He tries to be pleasant. He tries to dress like a normal person. And we like that. We like our dictators to be normal. If they're normal, we would rather not have to worry about them, and if they act normal, then we try not to. All right? Now, the trouble is that Syria right now is no longer acting normal. Right? They're trying, but they're failing. In January of 2011, the Arab Spring movement, which I had to tell you about a little bit earlier, came to Syria in the form of some minor protests. That's actually a pretty big deal. There haven't been really any protests since the 60s, but it was kind of like, well, we'll suppress this with our usual, make a couple people disappear, maybe 3 or 4 people will die, but it's nothing huge, all right? By March, however, you started having things like the largest full-scale demonstration since the previous president had been swept into power in a military coup, and things of that sort. And in response, you had soldiers opening fire on large groups of protesters and lots of people dying, and pretty much since then things have gone downhill. are a couple of different forces all fighting simultaneously. We have the government, which has this flag, and we have a whole bunch of different people. Some of them are kind of Islamic, like let's start an entirely Islamic government, and some are just wanting freedom, and some people are just finally they get a chance to kill their neighbors, and they've been waiting for that for a while. All of them collectively pretty much like this flag over here. I'm telling you what, if you gave me a quiz on this in a week, I would not remember which one is which. All right, this you really can't tell in a lot of ways which is which. Okay. People are getting killed all over the place, but nobody's really sure whether they're being killed by rebels or terrorists or the government. They've picked out CNN, they've picked out the BBC. Nobody has any clue what's actually going on. When you try to find out, what you do is you call the rebels and you say, could you please get a witness on Skype, and we'll have them sit down in front of a tiny little webcam and we'll ask them questions in their language and we'll hope that they're telling us the truth. That's pretty much what we know of what's going on in Syria is out of that kind of thing. Oh, and also satellite photography, which I totally have given you on the back page of your handouts, just because that's seriously what the BBC had to do to try to figure out what's going on. Okay. Meanwhile, nobody's really interested in intervening, despite the fact that all of these people are dying. And I've given you this image here too, and you can see that even here, the casualties are only in the thousands. You know. They're basically, Syria hasn't gone all nuclear on these people, and it still tries to pretend to be nice. Okay? When you hear about battles in the streets and children being, macheted to death and stuff, you have to understand that this is what these people look like. They look pretty much like, nice little civilized, college-educated types. That, plus the fact that we've had a global war on terror that really didn't work out very well, a whole lot of nation building that pretty much failed. People keep remembering things like Bosnia and Somalia and Sudan, and they start thinking to themselves, well, why on earth should we really, what on earth are we going to do? Plus Russia and China are just, in general, not being cooperative. They kind of like this guy. He's been able to work with them a lot. And so, in the end, nobody's really going to do anything. Unless we get a few more massacres, in which case we can pretty much throw all of this out and expect another Somalia or Bosnia or whatever, because nobody has any clue what to do other than that. So, any questions? Oh, come on, I know you guys have questions.
I haven't really been following what's been going on over there. What's the current situation over there in Syria?
As of today?
Yeah.
As of today, there's a couple of areas where the government essentially has no power at all. They are being completely held by what we are euphemistically referring to as rebel forces. But what they're trying to do is basically surround them outside the boundaries of these areas, and they're actually launching mortar attacks at this point. In the last about 12 hours, the town where this massacre had occurred, that's been all the news for the last few days, has been shelled several times. They're not really sure exactly whether they've evacuated all the people ahead of time or what. We're not sure what exactly they're bombing at this point, but that's sort of the idea. There are rebel strongholds, and those are the areas that are being focused on by the Syrian army. There's also several militia groups that are more or less indiscriminately killing people, and it's not entirely clear every time whether they're on one side or the other. There's about 7 or 8 distinct groups of fighters within what we're calling the rebel forces. There's also a couple of ad hoc militias, as well as this actual Syrian army. And many of the, quote, rebels are defectors from the Syrian army. So sometimes they look exactly like the army, but they're actually independent. They've taken equipment, they've taken officers, and the whole units have defected. So it's a little confusing, and since we're so limited on what we can actually tell, because everybody's been picked out, it's sort of difficult at times to be sure.
Real quick, one of the neighbors to the south, Israel. What's Israel's position?
Israel is really unhappy about this happening because while Syria is not a nice neighbor to have, they aren't like a lot of the other neighbors that they've had. Well, on the one hand, they do fund Hezbollah, and they do allow Palestinian, they supply arms to the Palestinians. They do things that Israel doesn't like. On the other hand, they're not as actively aggressive as many of the other neighbors that they've had. So they're more unhappy about the generic human rights issues or about the generic instability as opposed to being necessarily truly anti-Assad. So,
Thank you.
no problem.
Do you think technology played a part in the big change in 2010 of people having knowledge of what was happening? Like before, maybe they could have just killed a few people and then people wouldn't have noticed.
Yes. Yes. They call this a preference cascade, where all of a sudden, all at once, everybody realizes that nobody likes the guy in charge, whereas before everybody was sure they were the only guy who didn't like the guy in charge. And Twitter and Facebook and stuff help with that. Between 2008 and 2011, Assad actually heavily restricted Facebook and Twitter and a couple of other major websites, Wikipedia and a few others, but he never really went all the way like China does. And so some people think that in retrospect was a mistake. So, well, we're out of time, so thank you very much for your questions and have a great night.